Guten Tag, mein Name ist Clara Mavelia und ich
Hello,
leite das
my name is
Institut
Clara
für
Mavelia, and I'm head of the Cultural
Berlin.
Entrepreneurship
Heute ist mein
Institute
Gast
here in
Rolf-Dieter
Berlin.
Krause.
My guest
Er
today
leitet
is
das
Rolf-Dieter
ARD-Studio in
Krause,
Brüssel.
head of the
Willkommen zu unserer
ARD TV studio in
Community-Sendung.
Brussels.
Schön,
Welcome
dass
to
Sie
our
da sind,
community,
Herr
Mr.
Krause,
Krause.
und herzlichen
Good to see you,
Glückwunsch
Mr.
zu Ihrem
Krause,
Geburtstag.
and happy
Mögen
birthday.
Sie sich vorstellen?
Would you like to explain who you are?
Rolf-Dieter Krause. Ich bin Journalist.
My name is
Ich lebe
Rolf-Dieter
in Brüssel,
Krause. I'm a journalist,
arbeite dort seit
correspondent in
einigen Jahren für die
Brussels,
ARD.
and for some
Sie
time
sind
I've
ein
been
sehr
working for
beliebter
ARD.
Journalist
But you're a
und
very popular
ja,
journalist.
ja. Nein, das ist gut so. Wenn man nur beliebt ist,
But
dann
it's
macht
good if
man
you're
das
not
gut.
entirely popular, because if you're only popular, you're doing
Und Sie
something
haben
wrong.
eine wirklich große Reputation. Was macht
And
Sie
you
so
have a
erfolgreich?
very good reputation. What makes you so
Weiß
successful?
ich nicht.
I don't know.
Ich weiß gar nicht, ob ich das bin. Fängt
I
damit
don't
mal
know if
an.
I am successful. That's the first question.
Ich mache, was Millionen andere Menschen auch tun. Ich versuche meine
I
Arbeit
do what
ordentlich zu
millions
machen.
of other people do. I
Und
try
bin
to do a
froh, wenn
proper
es
job.
gelingt.
And I'm happy if I manage to do a proper
Jetzt
job.
erzählen Sie uns bitte etwas über Ihre Arbeit.
Good.
So,
Now
der,
tell
der
us a little
normale
bit
Mensch
about your work.
weiß nicht genau, was in einem Studio wie dem
Because ordinary mortals don't really know what happens in a studio like the ARD broadcasting studio in Brussels. Of
Können Sie
course,
einfach Ihre
Europe is a
Arbeit
very
bitte
important
beschreiben?
part of our lives. Can you describe your work?
Die Arbeit eines politischen Korrespondenten ist eigentlich
The
immer
work of a
egal.
political correspondent is
Im
the
Prinzip
same wherever you
jedenfalls.
go,
Ich
basically,
recherchiere, ich
anyway.
telefoniere, ich
I do my
spreche
research, I
mit
make
vielen
phone
Leuten.
calls, I talk to
Ähm,
lots of people,
Und wenn es wichtig genug ist, was ich dabei erfahre, mache ich
and
Berichte, die dann
if what I
in
find
den
out is
Sendungen des deutschen
important enough,
Fernsehens
I
laufen.
produce reports which are
Der
then
Unterschied
broadcast
zwischen
on German television.
Berlin und Brüssel ist vielleicht, also
The difference between Berlin and
wir
Brussels is
Deutschen haben alle
perhaps,
mindestens 3 Hauptstädte. Ne? Wir
let's
haben
say
eine
we Germans have at
Landeshauptstadt, wir haben
least
die
3 capital
Bundeshauptstadt
cities. We
und wir
have
haben
the
Brüssel als
federal state has its capital
Provinzhauptstadt. Das ist
city,
ja,
then we have
die
the federal
Unterscheidung sind
capital in
super, wenn
Berlin, and
man
then we have Brussels as our
Korrespondenten im
European
Ausland
capital.
arbeiten.
And that's what's perhaps
Meine
a bit
Kollegen, die in
different
Paris oder in
compared
Washington
with
oder
other
Moskau sind,
correspondents
die
working
berichten über
abroad. My
fremde
colleagues in
Länder
Paris, Washington,
für unser
Moscow are
Publikum
reporting on foreign
oder über
countries
Dinge,
for
die
our
ja,
audience.
andere Angelegenheiten sind, die vielleicht von uns,
They're
die uns
talking
zwar
about
betreffen.
affairs which
In Brüssel
might
berichte ich
interest
über
us,
unsere
but they're
eigenen
not our
Angelegenheiten.
business.
Es ist
In Brussels, I'm talking about our own
Politik,
business.
über die ich berichte.
So it's
Und
basically home affairs that I report on within the
viele meiner
European framework.
Gesprächspartner
The difference
kein
is that
Deutsch
a
sprechen.
lot of the people I speak
Die
to
meisten meiner
can't speak
Gesprächspartner
German.
sind Ausländer aus
Most
deutscher
of the
Sicht.
people I interview are
Niederländer,
foreigners from a German point of
Dänen,
view,
Finnen,
Italians, Dutch,
aus ganz
Danes,
Europa.
Finns,
Und
from all over
das verändert
Europe.
die Arbeit ein bisschen. Also als ich
And
Bonner
that changes the
Korrespondent
nature of
war,
the work a little. When I was correspondent in Bonn,
über die ich berichtet habe, gesehen, wie ich über
the
sie
people I
berichte.
was reporting on
Das
could see
verstehen.
what I said about them. They could
In Brüssel können
understand
das die
it.
meisten Leute nicht verstehen.
In
Zumal
Brussels,
auch
most
die
people can't
Tagesschau gar nicht, weil
understand
es
what
ja
I'm saying. They don't
Portugiesen
even
sind
watch
oder Briten.
Tagesschau on the German
Sehen da
news
ihre
because they're
eigenen
Portuguese or
Nachrichten. Das heißt,
British. They watch
verändert
their
ein
own
bisschen die
news.
Zusammenarbeit zwischen
So that rather
Journalisten
changes the way
und
you work
den
as a
Menschen, über die wir
journalist
berichten.
with
Weil auch ein
the
Politiker
people
will
you're
wissen, kann
reporting
er dem
on.
Journalisten vertrauen. Nicht im
Normally, a
Sinne von
politician wants to know,
Kumpanaille.
can I
Er
trust this
möchte gerne wissen,
journalist?
mit
Not
wem
in the
habe ich
sense
zu
of
tun.
he's an old
Sie möchte
mate,
ja auch wissen,
but
mit wem habe ich zu tun.
who am I dealing with here?
Und
I like to know who I'm
das ist
dealing
ein
with as
bisschen eine
well.
andere Arbeit als sonst.
And that's a
Sie
rather
als Korrespondenten
different
haben nach meiner Arbeit
perspective
gefragt. Meine
here.
Arbeit besteht nur zum Teil aus
You
der
asked
des
about my work as a
Korrespondenten und
correspondent. My
Journalisten.
work is
Unser
only
Studio ist
partly
nur
that
ein
of a correspondent and
kleiner
journalist. Our
mittelständischer
studio
Betrieb.
is like a
Und
small
als
company, an
Leiter des
SME.
Studios habe ich natürlich
And
auch
as
ein
head
paar
of studio,
Führungsaufgaben wahrzunehmen.
of course, I
Das
have a few
dafür
managerial
zu sorgen, dass
tasks
der
as well,
Apparat möglichst
which means I
reibungslos
have to make
arbeitet,
sure that the
dass Leute
machinery
gut
is running smoothly,
zusammenarbeiten
that people work
und
together well,
dass das Geld, das uns anvertraut ist,
and that
möglichst effizient
the money we
ausgegeben
are
wird.
entrusted with is spent as
Jetzt
efficiently as
verraten Sie
possible.
uns die paar Minuten, bevor Sie
Now
dann
explain to
zu
us
sehen sind,
the
dann
few
in
minutes
German. Wenn man
before
sagt, jetzt
you
unser Korrespondent
are there on the
sagt Ihnen, da
screen
ist
and
uns
when they're
eine
telling us
besondere
we're now going to
Reaktion
switch to
oder
our
eine
correspondent.
Bewegung
What's it
bevor
like? Is there
oder
a flurry of
wenn
excitement
Sie so ein
in those
bisschen
few minutes?
Connection, eine Verbindung
just before the connection is prepared with the studio back home, or is everything well planned? It depends. If it's a live report, then I just have to answer the questions, which means I've done my research already. Usually not just specific research about whatever we're talking about. A correspondent has to know a lot about the themes we're reporting on in general, and the more recent developments that we report on are an add-on. Of course, you have to acquire a lot of background information over the years. But if you're thinking about the 5 minutes before I go live, usually I'm putting my makeup on and attaching that little earpiece so that I can hear the return channel without feedback. And then I stand there and wait for the questions, just like I'm waiting for your questions, and I answer. It's a bit like making a phone call. Someone asks me something, I answer. It's not that dramatic. But how do you choose the items of news that are reported? Is there an order of significance, or is the motto, bad news is news? Well, firstly, I don't choose at all. The news desk does that. They decide what they think is important. We make offers and they decide what they want. We deliver. Our task is more to take that very complex body of news and select the items that are particularly important for people to form an opinion. You have to imagine that decisions by the European Union can be very hefty volumes, and there may only be 1 or 2 points that are particularly important, which you have to pick out. But it's not us that makes the decision about what will be broadcast. We decide how to do it, but what the themes are is decided by the news desk. And the bad news, of course. That's the unusual side to life. You don't want to read in your newspaper that millions of people are crossing the road without getting run over. In the newspaper, you want to read if someone has got run over when crossing the road. That's what makes it news, the unusual facet to it. The normal state of affairs isn't news. I think we can actually say then that bad news is good, because if not, normality would be bad. No, I think it's the way human interest works. If I ask you how you are and you say I'm well, then we've immediately dealt with the issue of how you are. If I ask you how you are and you say, oh, not so good, and I say, oh, what's the matter? Tell me. Have you got a problem? I think that's the way people are. We sometimes complain that we only hear bad news, but I think that's the way our interest works. We don't want to hear about normality. It's not a subject for conversation. It's wonderful if things are running normally, but we don't have to talk about it much. We can talk much better about things that aren't good. Okay, so you're head of studio, and perhaps we can dwell on that for a moment. Tell us what was decisive for you taking this position, because you have a great responsibility. You speak to us from Brussels about what is happening in Europe, which is very important for us. What made you the head of this studio? The most important thing was good luck and accident, chance. The second thing was that I wanted to do it. And the third most important thing was perhaps that through the work I'd done in the past, I had gained the confidence of my superiors. They believed I could do it. What do you find so fascinating about working as a journalist or as head of desk? As head of studio, of course, the higher up the hierarchy you go, the more you can decide for yourself what you want to do. Which means that on a day-to-day basis, people don't normally tell me how to go about my work. Of course, I have line managers, superiors, but perhaps the good thing about my job is that this is a process of argumentation rather than a hierarchy. I wanted to be head of studio or head of desk because I have a certain idea about how to manage, how to work with your staff, how to ensure that a team delivers properly without overworking, for example. And you can do that if you have a managerial position. So I was quite keen one day to take responsibility for a studio, and I was lucky. Luck is the decisive factor, because if you're not in the right place at the right time, and someone says, "Oh, I need someone just like you," then however good you are, you're not going to get that position. So it's half the battle. Chance. And why Brussels? At the outset, when I started working as a political correspondent, I began in my state capital, then I was in Bonn, and I was always listening to politicians saying, "Oh, we'd like to do this, but the EU won't let us. EU is forcing us to do this and that." So I wanted to know more about this EU. I became curious, and then I realized that very often this was just an excuse. And then I started to enjoy learning about other cultures. If you come to Brussels and you only move in German circles, you might as well pack your bags. The beautiful thing about that city is that you are forced constantly to have dealings, to talk to people from other countries, and especially journalists from other countries. If I want to understand something about Italy, I don't phone the embassy. I go to my colleague from Italy. They are journalists like I am. And if I want to know, for example, how they negotiate pay increases in Italy between management and trade unions, then my friend Renzo Consoli will know what I need to know, and he will explain it to me. I can ask him questions, because of course I know the situation in Germany, and then we can work out what the differences are, and we both learn from each other. And that is the great privilege that I have here, that I can constantly learn about the differences in other countries. It's a pleasure which has no end. I learn new things every day, and I'm even paid for it. And I enjoy it. Okay, let's stay with the studio for a bit, where you are manager. You say you like doing this work because you have your managerial ideas about leadership. What are your ideas about the best way to motivate people to get the best out of themselves? I think that everyone is able to take responsibility, and they are far too infrequently given the chance to do that. And I like to give my staff responsibility. When they are new on the team and they're not used to it, I try to ease them into it so they take responsibility. I am objective-driven. I tend not to give people instructions, very rarely. We talk together about the goals. What do we want to achieve, and what do we need to achieve that? We discuss a lot in the studio. We laugh a lot in the studio too. And I have every respect for the members of my staff, because they are very, very good people. There are about 30 of them in the studio, and they are, without exception, very good at what they do. And it's a great pleasure to me, given that most of them stay 5 years, to watch how they develop over those 5 years. At the end of the 5 years, almost all of them are able themselves to exercise managerial functions, because they've learned to take responsibility and to live it. And I ask a lot of them in that respect. Sometimes I'm asked why I do that, or how to do something, and I say, but you know how to do it. I think if people can see for themselves what's important, and you can always talk about it, of course, if they know how to go about it, then they're probably very able to be creative about this and have ideas which I might not have. So my experience demonstrates this. I get an awful lot more input for our work by doing this. That's one side to it. The other is that sometimes we go through tough times. Sometimes we have days which are basically double shifts. And if people don't enjoy coming to work, then it's almost unbearable. But if people do enjoy coming to work, then after 16 hours they will certainly be tired, but they're not unhappy. They have a sense of satisfaction, and they have a sense that we've done something. This is a feeling we often have, that as a team we really have achieved something, each of us in our own way. The camera people, technicians, the tape editors, the producers, the secretaries. And everyone is pleased with what they contributed to this result. Television is teamwork. I'm nothing on my own. Zero. But if everyone on the team enjoys their work and everyone gives the best they can, then what we create is better. And I'm delighted, because this isn't my performance, this is the studio's performance. And within ARD, our network, we have a good reputation as a studio, and that is to the credit of everybody. Everyone contributes. And that is something that we are all happy about. Usually I'm just the anchorman. I facilitate the process. The others do the work. That's fascinating. What I'd like to know is whether there are differences between the genders. Do men and women deal differently with news? No. I don't think that would be because they are men or women. Journalists deal differently with news. There are debates about which aspect is more important, but that's a quite normal intellectual process. I don't have the feeling that there's a difference between men and women. People are different, yes. There are people who want to delve into the depths, and others who say, no, I only need 1 or 2 minutes, so I don't need so much knowledge for the news program. But no, it's got nothing to do with men and women. I'm asking because you are closer to power, and power we envisage as male. You know, the cigars, the dark paneling, a lot of testosterone. We have those young men who cause a lot of trouble, as we're seeing these days, but as they get older, they need to compensate for that. We have so many examples from Putin, Berlusconi, Erdogan, who become irrational, and as an adult one asks what's going on in their minds. But you're closer to these people. I've only mentioned 3, of course, but I could name a longer list. What goes on in the minds of these people who have power like that? What makes them that way? Of course, well, you have to ask who aspires to power in the first place. Not everybody does. I think it's a certain type of human being that seeks power. And while you were asking your question, I was thinking, what about Ms. Merkel? Isn't she powerful? In the EU, she is no doubt one of the most powerful figures we have, not because she's Ms. Merkel, but because she's the German Chancellor. It's the biggest country in the EU, and the Chancellor of the biggest country is always going to have a certain amount of power. But I'm sure, and you're forcing me to say nasty things about men here. Sometimes you see it with little boys. They start to compete. They say, let's see who can pee the greatest distance. This constant measuring up and competing seems to be in our DNA. And then you get this alpha animal conduct amongst the powerful. It's all the more, because if they weren't alpha animals, they wouldn't be where they are now. So I'm sure it's a strong driving force to get to those positions. But from my point of view, it's not necessarily enviable, because just imagine, you can't go anywhere without being observed. Is that something to aspire to? I don't think so. Wherever you go, you've got your bodyguards at your shoulders. They can see everything you do. If you have a row with your wife, heaven knows what, or your children are in trouble, heaven knows. There are always these 2 bodyguards behind you. Is that something to aspire to? You only have to leave the building and there's a camera following you. Do you want that? I don't need it. I would never want it. I never thought that kind of thing was appealing. There must be some kind of a motive to want to have power, and it's not just the feeling that you want to give something back to society. There's a lot of ego involved, of course. Is that different elsewhere? But with Ms. Merkel, it's difficult to imagine that she does this because she likes the gilt trimmings or wants a load of young toy boys around. No, a lot of other people don't do it because of the girls and the gold trimmings. But that's not the point, I don't think. What you're saying, you're thinking about people like Berlusconi or Jan. But I think politics, for those who do it, is like a drug. You get addicted. I can imagine that it's a great temptation as a minister or a head of government to say, I think we ought to do this or that, and then a whole machinery is set in motion and starts doing it. That's amazing. Click, and the machine starts up. And that feeling, I can make things happen, yes. I think some people find that very appealing. I can understand. It would be, to me, a bit weird if there were no checks and balances. You hear about members of parliament who lose their seat and they lose their chauffeur-driven car, fall into a state of depression. It's awful, isn't it? Because power is like a drug. Yes, you have secretaries and assistants, PAs. At least now we have democratic mobile telephones. I can remember when car telephones were really expensive, and if you lost that perk, a lot of people found it tricky. Why are there 2 parliaments in Europe still, in Brussels and in Strasbourg? No, we have 1 parliament, but it has 2 locations. Theoretically, there's a 3rd plenary, all in Luxembourg as well, but it's never used. The reason why that is relates to the fact that there's one thing Parliament cannot decide for itself, and that is where it meets. In EU jargon, these are the location issues. Where is the headquarters of the institution to be? And these issues are decided by the heads of state and government, by an EU summit. And the heads of state and government have to decide it's not going to be Strasbourg, it's only going to be Brussels. As things are, the Parliament has to travel once a month. The MPs aren't really affected because they will come from their home countries anyway, but all the staff of the Parliament will travel to Strasbourg just for the 1 week. And I have to say, it's like a great big caravan with a lot of trucks, carrying all the office material down there, these great big metal crates full of material for every MEP. And on the Friday before that week in Strasbourg, it's all packed into these trucks and they all set off for Strasbourg. And sometimes the chauffeur cars as well. It's a lot of work. But it's very important for the city of Strasbourg because for a week the hotels are well filled and they charge high rates. ARD is an excellent broadcaster, certainly a news broadcaster. What would you improve, if anything? You've been working for them for such a long time. ARD is a pretty good construct, I believe. Sometimes it's a bit arduous. Sometimes it's just as arduous as the EU, because the ARD isn't a company after all. Most people don't even know what ARD stands for. It's a working network of German broadcasters. We are a community made up of the regional broadcasters which we have in the different states of Germany. So I'm not employed by ARD, but by West German Broadcasting, WDR. So whenever different parties have to get together, it can be an arduous process, like in Europe. But it has the advantage that sometimes there's a lot of healthy internal competition. There is difference and diversity. And in the case of ARD, there is a particular benefit, which is that we cannot be influenced by party politics. You may be able to exert influence on one member of the network, but then you'll find the other members are different. So in the best spirit of the word, it is an anarchistic structure. Of course, we have to obey the law. That's important. And if somebody wants to complain about my work, there is a very effective remedy available to complain about me. We don't work in a vacuum. We're not exempt from responsibility, and we can be called to account for our responsibility. But the idea, if I think about other countries, in France, for example, the president of France can call the boss of France Télévisions and say, I'm giving the job to someone else. Ms. Merkel can't do that, thank heavens. Not even the First Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia can sack me. And as long as we do our job well, properly, observing the law and observing the rules of the trade, this construct, arduous as it sometimes may be, offers us a lot of responsibility and freedom. And I know a lot of, well, sometimes we are cursed, of course, that's fine. Sometimes people are right to curse us. But I know a lot of American colleagues, for example, who say, if we had something like you have, then communication in our society would be quite different. Yes, I think the media may be a business, but they're not only a business. They are essential to a democracy, to make sure that democracy functions properly. And of course media have dependencies. Commercial media have their commercial dependencies, and we have sometimes seen that public broadcasters experience political dependencies. It doesn't have to be the case. It's often a matter of who we're talking about. Martin Luther King used to say, freedom is also an act of will. And I like that motto very much. If I want to be free, it may be people are making it difficult for me, but I can achieve it. If I don't want to be free from the outset and I subjugate myself, I'll never be free. And this system we have at ARD offers a lot of opportunities for that. I'm delighted that a lot of colleagues make the best use of that to serve our viewers. That's what it's about. We want to reliably inform our viewers so that they can rely on us, so that we earn their trust, and you have to earn it by the day. Confidence is very easily shattered and grows very slowly. And if every now and then you can have the feeling that the viewers trust you, then we've done our job well. And we do it for them. And that is the very particular construct that we have, because my viewers are not just my clients, they are my employers. WDR doesn't belong to a government or a state, but to the people in that state. So ARD is that in the true spirit of the word. We are a company owned by the people. So you are an independent journalist, we can say. Every journalist experiences that people attempt to influence you, to use you. I've experienced attempts to put pressure on me. But I have always been able to resist that. It was up to me whether I wanted to give in to that pressure or not. And as I don't like giving into pressure, I didn't. But that as a journalist you can make a mistake or notice a little too late that you are being fed specific information and manipulated, of course, none of us is perfect. But the opportunity to resist influence that is unjustifiable is strong in this system, and I'm very grateful that I can work in this structure. It's a privilege. It's interesting that you say that. I sometimes wonder how much a normal, ordinary citizen or viewer is allowed to find out about the things that are going on around us. What happened really with Uwe Barschel in Switzerland, or with Franz Josef Strauss and those submarines in South Africa, or who really shot Olof Palme? These are questions which remain there as riddles, which have no answers. You're closer to the solution of those riddles. I don't think that we can always find the answers to the questions. Of course, they have to be correct answers. One thing I am convinced of, however, is that if journalists have knowledge, they share it. I don't believe there are any journalists anywhere who, whether voluntarily or not, don't pass on information they have. Not for long anyway, maybe a week, but not for long. I think the cases that you mentioned, those famous assassinations, if a journalist really knew the answer ultimately, we know these things haven't been resolved, of course. But there are some facts that don't come out. And don't forget, journalists are not public prosecutors. Thank heavens, we aren't allowed to raid houses and confiscate documents. We can't arrest people. We depend on the information we get being given to us voluntarily. We can't exert pressure on people. I don't want to. All right, I've become a public prosecutor, and I didn't want to become a public prosecutor. I wanted to be a journalist. That means I pass on information that I get from other people, which I have checked to the best of my ability, that I have thought about, to see if they're plausible, these facts. And if I then decide, okay, that's how it is, then I report it. But even that isn't to be measured by the criteria of scholarship. Journalists can make mistakes. The important thing is that they try not to. But of course journalists can make mistakes, as other people can. Okay, good. We've heard a lot of interesting things from you so far, and we need to draw to a conclusion. I wanted to ask you, what are your plans for the future? Where would you like to apply your energy? I am gradually preparing mentally for my retirement. The end of my career will happen in the foreseeable future. And then my life after that will be different. That is clear. But I think I still have some exciting time left. And of course you can't really prepare for it. Because if you do day-to-day journalism, you depend on what's happening. And in my case, it's politics. and I will have to report on it,
Auswahl der
whatever
Themen
happens. So the
ist ja nicht
choice of
so, von
themes,
daher ja schon frei.
from that point of view,
Aber ich
isn't
kann nicht
really
über
mine.
einen EU-Gipfel berichten, wenn er nicht stattfindet.
I can't report on an EU summit if it doesn't happen.
Europa hat jede Menge politischer Probleme, die
And
keine
Europe
Lösung
has a
haben.
lot of political problems that need to be resolved and that people are working on. And that's going to keep me busy over the next year and a half, I'm sure.
Bereite ich mich nicht auf was Bestimmtes vor.
So I'm not preparing for anything specific.
Am Horizont lauert, ist die Pension.
But what does loom on the horizon is my pension.
Viele schöne Bücher über Ihre Arbeit.
But that means you'll write lots of wonderful books about your work.
Wissen Sie,
No, no, no.
ich arbeite
You know,
gerne, ich arbeite auch gerne hart.
I love my work.
Muss nicht,
I love working hard.
wenn ich das Berufsleben hinter
But
mir habe.
once I've finished my professional life, I don't need to carry on churning it out, no.
Gut geht, auf mein Motorrad setzen und
If things work well, I shall get on my motorbike and travel.
Buch bin ich bestimmt gespannt. Und zwar,
But there's one book I am looking forward to, because you've been reporting on Europe for such a long time, or working with Europe, and you're going to carry on doing that for some time. It would be really interesting to hear about whether the identity of Europe is more economic or cultural, related to our traditions. Can you tell us?
weil ich habe schon ein Buch
I don't want to write that book, because I have written a book already and one's enough.
Ich glaube, dass es mehr mit Kultur zu tun hat, aber ich meine
I think it's more about culture. But perhaps I mean something different by culture from you, because culture is also a big obstacle to European integration. And I'm not talking about culture in the sense of the arts and literature,
in unseren Gesellschaften
but the culture that
das Verhältnis zwischen Bürgern
operates in our societies, the relationship between citizens and the state, or economic culture. How do managers and trade unions deal with each other? What do we expect from one another? There are very simple questions. What's a rule? Is a rule something that you have to obey, or is a rule that you take guidance from? In Italy and Germany, you'll get very different answers to that question. And I think that these things play a much greater role than is often reflected in our political debate. We often talk about very specific political decisions, economic decisions, but what we actually mean when we use words, the substance of those concepts, there we talk very differently in all countries. And in all countries we have the same right to do that. The difficult thing is to make them match. So that brings us to the last question, which we always ask all our guests. And I'm particularly curious in your case, as you are closer to the corridors of power. What do you think ultimately is the most important thing in life? That's a difficult question. I think, for me, the most important thing is to be as in touch with myself as possible, to have a clear conscience, to feel I'm in control of my own decisions. Thank you for your time.